My daughter-in-law dug her fingernails into my son's forearm across a restaurant table on the night of his 31st birthday. He didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He went completely still, the way an animal goes still when it's learned that struggling makes the grip tighten. Her father sat 3 feet across from him, watched the whole thing happen, and smiled. Then he said, loud enough for the couple at the next table to turn their heads, "You brought that on yourself, Elle. You always do." I was sitting right there, 2 feet away. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't do one single thing you'd expect a father to do when somebody hurts his kid in front of him. And in 22 days, Tara Voss lost her registration with the Ontario College of Social Workers, her sole access to the joint accounts she'd been controlling for 4 years, and the version of my son she'd spent that entire time carefully building from scratch. I want to tell you how that happened, because the way it happened matters a great deal more than what happened. My name is Stuart Baird. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as an auditor with the Canada Revenue Agency, mostly out of the Hamilton Tax Services office on Main Street East. 31 years of pulling financial records, tracing money through amended filings and shell accounts, and the kind of careful creative paperwork that people produce when they are absolutely certain nobody's paying close attention. The whole job comes down to one rule I learned in my 3rd year and never once forgot. The document doesn't lie. People lie about the document. People misread it, misplace it, claim they never had it. But the document itself just sits there waiting for someone to be patient enough to find it. I carried that rule with me for 31 years. It turns out it applies to a great deal more than tax files. My wife was Carol. She taught grade 4 at a school in Dundas for 22 years, and she was the kind of teacher that parents still put on their children's emergency contact forms, years after those kids had graduated, just to stay in her orbit somehow. She died 4 years ago in November, pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to the end, and there wasn't one moment of those 8 weeks where she stopped being more interested in everybody else than in herself. I have had a complicated relationship with that sentence ever since. I haven't touched her marking basket. It's still on the counter in the kitchen beside the phone stand, holding a library book she never got to finish and a red pen with the cap still on. Some things you don't move until you know where they belong. My son is Elliot. He's 31, works in IT support for a logistics company out of Burlington, and he has his mother's patience and my tendency to hold things inside until they come out sideways. He married Tara Voss 2.5 years ago at a venue on Dundas Street West in Oakville. I sat in the front row. I gave the toast. I said I was gaining a daughter, and I meant it when I said it. That's something I've had to sit with. Tara is 34. She's a registered social worker, certified through the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. She works for a family services agency in Hamilton, the kind of organization that supports people in difficult home situations, connects families with resources, writes reports that go before the courts. It's important work. When I first met her, I thought that said something good about who she was. I revised that opinion slowly, the way you revise things when you genuinely don't want to. Her father is Wayne Voss, 61, licensed real estate broker, runs a boutique brokerage out of Westdale that he's had for 16 years. He's the kind of man who fills every room he walks into, not because he's interesting, but because he's loud in a way people mistake for confidence. He has an opinion on everything and delivers it before being asked. First time I met him, I thought, this one has never once doubted himself and he's not about to start. I filed that away without saying it out loud. It's a habit. The dinner was a Friday in late April, Elliot's birthday. He'd picked the restaurant himself, a place on Wilson Street in Ancaster, good food, not too loud. The kind of room where you can actually have a conversation. There were 5 of us, me, Elliot, Tara, Wayne, and Tara's mother, Glenda, who is a quiet woman who has spent a significant portion of her life, from what I can observe, carefully not being noticed. I've thought about Glenda a lot since that night. She doesn't factor into what came after, but she matters to the before. I want to go through the next 14 minutes carefully, the way I used to go through a flagged file. Frame by frame, looking for where the thing actually starts. It started with a phone. Elliot had his out on the table, face up beside his fork. He'd been showing me something earlier, a photo he'd taken at the bay on his lunch break. He'd been walking more since the winter. Tara said something low and short to him about the phone. I didn't catch it. He turned it face down. She said something else, and I caught the last part, every single time. He didn't answer. His jaw moved slightly on the right side. I know that jaw movement. It's not stubbornness. It's what a person's face does when they're swallowing something they've swallowed many times before and have become very practiced at. Wayne was talking about a property he'd listed in Flamborough. Glenda was listening to him with the expression of someone who has heard this story in several prior versions. Then Tara's hand moved. Not toward her wine glass, not to gesture at something. She reached across her own plate, closed her right hand around Elliot's left forearm just below the elbow, and she turned it. Maybe 45 degrees. Her nails pressed in and the muscles in her forearm went tight. I could see it from where I sat. Elliot didn't make a sound. He put his right hand flat on the table and looked down at his plate. I have sat across a table from people who falsified business expense records for 8 consecutive years and kept my voice level and my pen moving. I have reviewed documents representing the most deliberate dishonesty a person can commit and never once raised my voice in an interview. I have never in my life had to do what I did in the next 4 seconds. I kept my hands flat on the table, and I started watching instead of moving, because 31 years of auditing teaches you the same thing every careful professional learns eventually. The scene holds more information when you haven't disturbed it. Wayne glanced over, saw what was happening, and said, unhurried, conversational, the way you'd comment on a bad weather forecast. He knows better than to have that thing out at dinner, don't you, Elle? It wasn't a question. Glenda looked at the tablecloth. Tara let go. She picked up her wine glass. When Elliot reached for his water, his left forearm came up briefly above the tablecloth. 4 small red marks just below the elbow, already going dark at the edges. I counted them the way I count things. 4. I need to be honest with you about the next 10 seconds, because I've turned them over more times than I can count. I was not calm. I want to say that clearly. I am good at staying controlled, and I was not calm. There was something happening in my chest that had nothing to do with composure, and everything to do with the fact that I had just watched somebody put marks on my son's arm at his birthday dinner, while his father-in-law told him he'd brought it on himself. What I was aware. Aware that if I stood up, the story became about me. A 63-year-old man making a scene at a restaurant in Ancaster. That's the version that goes into every document from that point forward. That's the first line of every filing Tara's lawyer produces. That's what she argues from, for however long the case runs. And Elliot goes home that night with her, with that charge loaded against him, that his father had to come in and make things worse on top of everything else. I have seen that happen. Not guessed it might, seen it happen. A man I worked with lost his temper at a family function and did nothing wrong by any reasonable moral measure. But he lost it in public, and that became the record, and it cost his family 3 years of custody arrangements. Nobody had wanted because everything started with him in a parking lot. The angriest person in the room is the most manageable one. You learn that doing audit interviews. It's the person who stays quiet that the other side can't predict. My hand moved to my jacket pocket. I took out my phone, opened the camera, hit record, and set it down on the tablecloth angled toward Elliot and Tara, flat and casual as a set of car keys. I let it run. Wayne was still talking about the Flamborough property. Tara poured herself more wine. Elliot hadn't moved. I let it run for 53 seconds. In those 53 seconds, Elliot's forearm where his sleeve had ridden up. The 4 marks. Tara's hand still close to his side of the table. Wayne's voice in the background saying the listing was priced like fantasy. Glenda, still looking at the tablecloth. Nobody noticed the phone. People who are comfortable doing something in a public room don't look around to see who's watching. That's one of the consistent things I observed across 3 decades of interviewing people who believed they hadn't been caught. I stopped the recording, pocketed the phone, finished my water. When the server came by, I asked for the bill. Wayne said we hadn't had dessert. I said I was fine for dessert. I paid the whole thing, all 5 of us, including the bottle of wine Tara had ordered without looking at the price. Then I stood up, looked at my son and said, Elliot, let's get some air. He looked at Tara, then at Wayne, then at me. Something in my face, I wasn't managing it by then, I was simply looking at him, made him push back his chair. Tara started to say something. I turned and looked at Wayne Voss. One look. The face I used when I was about to tell someone that the numbers they'd submitted for 6 consecutive years didn't match their bank statements and we were going to sit here until we understood why. I said, thank you for coming, enjoy the rest of your evening. And I walked out of that restaurant with my son. We sat in my car in the parking lot for a while, engine off, windows beginning to fog. He didn't say anything, and I didn't push him. I turned the heat on and waited the way you wait when you know the other person needs to find where to start. He said, Dad, don't do anything. I said, already did something. He said, what do you mean? I said, I have it on video, her hand the marks. Long pause. Dad. Elliot, I said, has she done that before? He looked out the passenger window. A couple was walking past toward the restaurant entrance, laughing about something. He watched them until they were through the door. He said not like he stopped, started again, not usually where it shows. I've done enough interviews to hear the shape of an answer and understand what's been left out. That answer had a great deal left out. I said, how long? Nothing. Elliot. He said to the window about 2 years. Then he told me, not all at once. In pieces, the way people tell things when they've been holding them so long. They're not sure how many pieces there are until they start pulling them out one by one. It wasn't always physical. Mostly it was the accounts. Both salaries going into a joint account she managed. And his transfer access had been removed after a disagreement in their first year that he was still not entirely sure how it had happened. His spending money came from what she allocated into a secondary account. $800 a month for what she called personal expenses. She went through his phone most evenings. When he visited me, she wanted a full accounting of the conversation afterward. There had been 4 incidents involving physical contact. 3 of them he'd told himself weren't what they were, because she always had an explanation, and the explanation always placed the cause with him somehow. The 4th incident was tonight. He stopped talking, and I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked the thing I hadn't wanted to ask. Why didn't you tell me? He turned from the window and looked at me for the first time since we'd gotten in the car. He said, because you'd have gone back in there, like you almost did tonight. I want to sit with that for a moment because it's the part of this story that undoes me most, and I still haven't entirely made sense of it. He wasn't saying I hadn't cared enough. He was saying I'd cared in the wrong direction. He had spent 2 years managing a dangerous situation by himself, and part of what he'd been managing was me. What I'd do, what I'd say, whether I'd make it worse the way men make things worse when they believe their job is to fix it immediately and visibly, in front of everyone. 31 years ago I told myself I was going to raise a son who didn't flinch, who could handle himself, who didn't come running back with every difficulty, because that's not how you build a person who's ready for the world. I raised him to be strong. What he heard was, don't bring me anything you can't handle on your own, because bringing it here means admitting you can't handle it, and that's not what we do. So he carried it alone, 2 years, 4 incidents, a bank account that was technically his and practically wasn't. I didn't say any of that in the car. I put my hand over his on the armrest. I said, okay, here's what happens now. You're coming home tonight. Tomorrow morning I make some calls. You don't have to decide anything tonight, just let me work. He said, Dad, I don't want this to become. I said, Elliot, she puts on your arm at a birthday dinner while her father told you that you'd brought it on yourself. This already became something. I just want to make sure we get to decide what it becomes. A pause, then one small nod. The nod of someone who has been carrying something for a very long time and has quietly decided to put it down. He fell asleep on the couch in the spare room. I sat at the kitchen table and watched that recording 4 times. The marks were visible. Her hand, his forearm, Wayne's voice in the background, Glenda looking at the tablecloth. Everything exactly where it had been. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to Monica Ferreira. She'd been a family law paralegal for 12 years before going back for her law degree. And she's been practicing in Hamilton for 8 years since. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I had and sent the video while we were still on the phone. She called back 9 minutes later. She said, Stuart, she's a registered social worker with the college. I said, I know. Pause. The OCSW-SSW professional conduct process, an incident like this documented where the registrant is on video physically harming a family member, that doesn't sit in a queue, not when there's a video. I said, good. She said, and the financial picture you're describing, if Elliot can document the account access restrictions, the allocation structure, that's relevant to the divorce under family property provisions. Everything acquired during the marriage is presumptively split equally under the Family Law Act, but the financial control is context that matters. Another pause. You didn't touch anyone. I said, didn't need to. She said, that's the whole case. Keep it that way. Call me at 8 in the morning. The second call was to the Hamilton Police non-emergency line. The constable who took my preliminary report was careful and patient. She told me someone would contact me within 24 hours for a formal statement. I made a pot of tea and sat at Carol's kitchen table. Under the light she always said was too yellow. And I thought about a woman who spent her working days writing reports about families in distress, then drove home that evening apparently registering no dissonance whatsoever. In the morning, Elliot and I sat at the same table for 3 hours. He showed me the banking app on his phone. View-only access on a joint account, with a balance that should have been significantly higher based on what he'd told me their combined salaries were. He'd been allocated $800 a month in a secondary account for personal expenses. He had texts going back 22 months. The checking-in texts. The where are you texts. The you said you'd be home by 6 and it's 6:14 texts. And the texts that came after each of the 4 incidents. Long, carefully constructed messages explaining how his behavior had made her reaction unavoidable, and how she needed him to understand that she would not be disrespected in her own home. She wrote them the way someone who produces professional reports writes everything. Structured, clear, building a record from her perspective. What she didn't know was that Elliot had never deleted a single one. Monday morning I was in Monica's office at 8:30 with Elliot's phone, my recording, and 4 months of bank statements he'd screenshot the night before. Monica had already pulled the OCSW-SSW professional conduct complaint form. She'd been up early. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "The college treats these seriously when the registrant holds professional responsibilities over vulnerable people." I said, "I know." She said, "Wayne Voss is RICO licensed." I said, 16 years. She said, "He's on that video. RICO has its own conduct standards." She wrote something down. "We don't submit everything at once. We sequence it." That was exactly the right instinct. You don't flood the file. You build it cleanly in order, so that every piece is documented before the next one lands. The formal police statement was taken Monday afternoon. The constable confirmed that Ontario's recording consent provisions meant the video was fully admissible. A public restaurant carries no expectation of privacy, and one-party consent covers the audio. She watched the recording twice and wrote for a long time. She said, "The marks on your son's arm, has he been photographed?" Monica had photographed them Sunday morning. 4 marks on Elliot's left forearm, bruised deep purple by then, consistent with fingernail pressure, time-stamped. I said, "Yes." She said, "This is a solid file, Mr. Baird." Tuesday, Monica filed for divorce under the Divorce Act and filed an emergency motion for temporary exclusive possession of the matrimonial home under the Family Law Act, supported by the video, the photographs, the text history, and a financial disclosure request requiring Tara to produce complete account statements going back to the start of the marriage. Tara was served Wednesday morning at her office. I'm told her supervisor was present when it happened. Thursday, the Hamilton police issued a summons for Tara Voss. Assault. Summary conviction. I want to be clear about this because people who hear these stories expect something dramatic to happen. She wasn't arrested. She was summoned. That is the process, and the process was doing exactly what it is designed to do. Friday morning, I received a call from an investigator with the Ontario College of Social Workers and Social Service Workers. A complaint had been filed. A professional conduct review had been opened. The investigator was professional and did not tell me in explicit terms how seriously the file was being treated. She didn't need to. A call on a Friday morning from an assigned investigator tells you everything about where a file sits. Wayne Voss received a letter from RICO the following week. I know this because Tara's lawyer mentioned it during early disclosure exchanges, apparently with some heat in the reference that suggested someone had been surprised it had arrived. I was not surprised. When a licensed professional is recorded on video endorsing a physical assault and informing the victim that he had it coming, the regulatory body that issued that license has a legitimate interest in what kind of judgment that professional exercises. The emergency motion for exclusive possession was granted by the Ontario Superior Court of Justice on the second Friday after filing. Elliot stayed with me. He brought almost nothing when he came: a bag of clothes, his laptop, his work equipment. He'd left behind most of what had accumulated in 2.5 years of shared life, because most of it had been acquired through accounts that were technically joint and practically weren't, and those would need to be addressed through the property settlement. He brought one thing specifically. On his second permitted trip back to the house to collect items from the approved list, he came home with a cardboard box from the top shelf of the garage. My old Leafs jerseys from the 90s. Not the good ones, the kind nobody would pay money for. That I'd worn through 2 seasons of recreational hockey in my mid-40s and given to Elliot when he first moved out because he'd always thought they were ridiculous in an affectionate way. Tara had put them in a sealed box on the highest shelf of the garage and told him they were taking up space. He hadn't argued. He'd put them up there, and that was 2 years ago. He set the box on my kitchen table. He said, "I figured you'd want those back." I said, "They were always yours." He looked at the box for a moment, then he sat down. Tara's lawyer came in hard at first. Procedural motions, a lot of volume. That's standard opening positioning. Then Monica sent the full package, the recording, the photographs, 22 months of texts, the financial disclosure results showing exactly what the joint account had held and exactly what Elliot's actual access had been. The police report, the college complaint, the RICO referral, and a chronology Elliot and I had built together over 2 mornings at the kitchen table. Dates, descriptions, in his own words, which took a great deal out of him and which he did anyway. Tara's lawyer went quiet in a way I've heard before. It's the sound of a strategy being thrown out and rebuilt from scratch, around the actual evidence rather than around what the other side might not have. Settled in 11 days, Elliot's pension contributions protected. The matrimonial home equity split as required under Ontario family property law. The joint accounts untangled, his portion transferred within 10 business days, the temporary restraining order made permanent by consent. No contest, no hearing. Monica called me the morning the order was confirmed. She said, "It's done, Stuart, filed and complete." I was standing in the kitchen. Carol's red pen still in the basket by the phone stand. Monica said, "You built this clean." I said, "I didn't build anything, I just made sure I didn't knock it over." That afternoon Elliot came by. He brought coffee from the Tim Hortons on Dundas, 2 doubles, the way he's been doing since he was old enough to drive. He still can't remember I drink mine black. I didn't say anything about it. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee that was too sweet and we talked for a long time about things that had nothing to do with any of this. His job, a trip he was thinking about taking out to BC in the fall, a woman in his office who he thought might be worth asking for coffee. I said I had no opinion about that. He said say it anyway, so I said probably yeah. At some point he looked across at me and said, "Dad, in the parking lot that night you almost went back in." I said, "I thought about it." He said, "Why didn't you?" I told him what I'd told myself sitting in the front seat with the engine off. That if I'd gone back into that restaurant, this whole thing becomes a story about a 63-year-old man losing his temper at a birthday dinner in Ancaster. That goes into every document from that point forward. That's what Tara's lawyer argues from for however long the case runs. And Elliot goes home that night, and the next morning, with one more piece of leverage loaded against him, and no evidence of anything, except a father who couldn't manage himself in public. I said, "I wasn't calm, Elliot. I want to be straight with you about that. I was the opposite of calm. But calm isn't the point. Useful is. And the thing I could do that would actually help you was not standing up." He thought about that for a while. Then he said, "The CRA thing." I said, "The CRA thing. So here's what this whole business taught me. And it is not the thing you'd expect. Everyone wants the lesson to be patience. Stay calm. Keep your temper. I'm not saying that because it isn't true and it isn't useful and I wasn't calm anyway. Telling a person to calm down while they're watching someone hurt their child is the most hollow advice in the history of advice. Here's what's actually true. Anger is energy, that's all it is. Energy with no destination. The question is never whether you're angry, you're going to be angry, and that's appropriate, because something has happened that warrants it. The only question is whether the thing you do with that energy in the next 30 seconds makes the person you love safer 3 months from now, or just makes you feel better in the next 3 minutes. 3 minutes against 3 months, that's the whole calculation. It's available to everybody and it costs nothing. The other lesson is the one I'd trade everything else to take back. I raised my son to be the kind of man who handles things, who doesn't complain, who doesn't come back to his father with problems he's supposed to be dealing with himself. I thought I was giving him something valuable. I thought I was making him strong and capable and ready for the world. What I was actually teaching him was that bringing me a problem meant admitting he couldn't handle it, and I had made it very clear, over 31 years, that not handling things was not something men in this family did. He didn't hide it from me because he didn't trust me. He hid it from me because he did. He trusted me enough to know exactly what I'd do, and he loved me enough to decide I shouldn't do it. I have thought about that every single day since we sat in the parking lot. If you're listening to this and you have someone in your life who thinks of you as the strong one, the one who handles it, the one people call, I'm asking you to do one small thing. Find that person. Tell them, in plain words, that whatever they're carrying, they can put it down with you. And then say the second part out loud, that you promise you will not make it worse. That part is the one that matters. Most people who stay quiet aren't doing it because they think you don't care. They're doing it because they're not sure you'll wait. If anything in this story sounded like your house, the accounts, the texts, the careful sorting of what's just how things are from what's actually not acceptable, that's worth taking seriously. In Canada, the Assaulted Women's Helpline is 1-866-863-0511. It's available around the clock. It talks to men too, because this happens to men too, and asking for help is not a failure at anything. You don't need a plan. You don't need to know what you want to do next. You're allowed to just pick up the phone and ask one question. Comment 1 if you think I did the right thing reaching for my phone instead of standing up. Comment 2 if you think a father who sits there while somebody hurts his kid has failed him, regardless of what comes later. And comment 3 if you think the college complaint and the RICO referral went too far, that there's a line between protecting your son and settling a score, and that I may have crossed it. I go back and forth on 3 myself. I'm being honest about that. If you've ever had to hold completely still while something happened to somebody you love, because you knew that moving would make it worse for them and not for you, tell me. Tell me what you did with it afterward. I'm still working on that part. It's just past 9 here. The kitchen light is on. Elliot's car is still in the driveway, and there's a cardboard box of old jerseys sitting on the table, and that is something I have not taken for granted once since the November 4 years ago when I stopped having a reason to leave a light on at all. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Hamilton, Ontario to create original content. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is coincidental.